Hello, welcome back to another episode of Somewhere Between a Film and TV podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Parra, and number one, thank you so much for listening and watching. Number two, if you could please down below like, comment, and subscribe. What did you think of Sam Raimi? Return to form for Sam Raimi here with the new horror comedy. It's funny when you look at the description here in a second, it says psychological horror. A little bit, but like for sure there's an element of that in there. But I am very excited to talk about this. I'm sorry guys, that AI Chris Pratt thing, I was gonna see it, but here in the area I live in Texas, which I think I've name dropped before, but we had a iced out storm and I figured, well, I might be able to catch up on that, but for now, let's just review this one since we have the time. And what is Sam Raimi's Send Help about? Well, this stars Rachel-McAdams and Dylan O'Brien. There's some people earlier on, but this is a two-part back and forth for sure. The film follows an overworked employee and her boss who are the only survivors of a plane crash on a deserted island. It also definitely falls under the horror comedy genre to me because Sam Raimi, if you do not know who this is, and let's face it, I mean, let's just acknowledge that not everybody knows everyone. And Sam Raimi is very well known for being a pioneer of indie horror back in the late 70s, the 80s. He's the creator of the Evil Dead franchise, which was a pioneer thing for. He's definitely inspirational to me as well. Like the Evil Dead, the very first one, was very famous for a lot of its very guerrilla style, very candid kind of just really, really down to the ground budget filmmaking. He would do these things where he would build his own rigs out of wood. I read that story. There was a lot of stylistic choices that come from that he has been driving ever since. And I think that I was a big fan of The Last Doctor Strange, but obviously he had constraints there just in terms of fitting into the studio mold. This is still technically under Disney. It's under the 20th Century logo, which even still has the old school fanfare in this one. Thought that was really cool. That was a great touch. But really fully getting into this in particular, Sam Raimi as a director, I love. Goes without saying, he made Spider-Man, obviously. He made Drag Me to Hell, The Evil Dead, and like we just mentioned, Doctor Strange. But really, this is him returning to his roots. This is him back doing what he knows how to do best, which is the horror comedy driven by a lot of really kind of gross out humor. There are jump scares that he loves doing. There's even, I want to mention this, everything we review here will always have full spoilers. So if you have not seen Send Help yet, there are some twists and turns that are in this movie that I don't want to ruin for you. So if you have not seen this yet, get out of here. But like this and subscribe so you can come back after you see it, because I do in fact highly recommend it. But first, let's answer the question with Send Help. Did I love it? Did I hate it? Or am I somewhere between on it? I thought that this was a ton of fun. This was fantastic. I loved it overall. There's some minor things here and there about it, but I loved this. I thought it was such a great time. I thought that this is exactly the type of horror comedy that's definitely in my zone for sure. I can really appreciate gross out humor when it is utilized really well. And I think that it's utilized really, really well here. I'm a huge fan of Drag Me to Hell, actually. I saw that at a very, very strange age. I cannot remember how old I was when that came out, but I was terrified of seeing it because of what it was when the age that I was when it was coming out. And then it was a horror comedy, and in retrospect, it was definitely very funny. But I remember at the time not really registering that tone, and I was just like, what is going on? It was just this level of absurdity for a horror movie that I had never really quite seen before. And it's so funny because I think that one of the marks of a clearly, truly great director is whenever you can really feel their stamp on stuff. So in order to fully transition into the positive, the negative, the everything somewhere between, let's first get into the positive. Even before I want to talk about the stars that are in this, the primary two, Sam Raimi and Bill Pope are legends. They are so great at what they do. Bill Pope has definitely had his misses cinematography-wise, but I would argue that maybe that was under the constraint of fitting under a mold. But here, this movie has such an interesting look to it, and it has such a kind of baked kind of sunlight, and sure, there's a CG sheen every now and again, but for the most part, I really, really loved how this looked, and I really loved the utilization of the landscape and the adaptability of... There's a lot of interesting lens choices in this in particular, and yes, Sam Raimi is the type of director where I'm going to get nerdy on the physical aspects of this. Early on, you can definitely tell there's a clear style with his mark, where when Dylan O'Brien's character is first introduced, Bradley, and he's talking to Rachel-McAdams, and she has like tuna all over her face, and it has this zoom in on his eyes and this zoom in on her mouth, and it's just so close to the point where you're like, I do not need to be this close to their faces. But it's really, really well done, because it's a showcase, a utilization of the fact that he is like irritated and grossed out by her almost immediately, because then after, when he's like, he sees the tuna on his hand, which at first you think is a continuity error, which I thought was brilliant, but then it's there on his hand, and he's like showing it to his, like, whatever his relationship is to the guy that he's with, and he's like, can you smell this? He's like, I'm not gonna smell that. And then you see a zoom in like on his nose while he does this, and it's just so funny. And one of the clear indicators of that is like Sam Raimi. So one of the introductions to him, the Spider-Man movies, the Raimi films in the Spider-Man trilogy are so singular in terms of their vision, their identity as superhero movies. It's why they're so influential in the first place. And people often go back to the scene in Spider-Man 2 with Doc Ock when he's first in the hospital. And there are so many moments that are in this movie that are not only visually like that, I also noticed that he has a particular fixation on sound mixing when it comes to that. All of the noises are heightened. You can hear every little individual sort of clink and clank, and here it's more zeroed in on... I noticed this during the airplane crash, the initial sequence where they first go. It's Raimi instantly back in his mode, because it's really funny, it's really chaotic. It reminds me a lot of Evil Dead 2 as well, where the camera starts shifting and gliding around, but it's also a little bit erratic at the same time. But he's definitely leveled up his technology, but he still cannot help but try and go for that handheld look as well. But since it's probably a bigger camera and all of that, it's very much more like a gliding feel. And you could just see the ramifications of everything going on. Like, there's all the... I love this one shot where the plane goes down and then the people go up, but the camera moves with them, and you just like can feel it visually represented. And I thought that was just really fascinating filmmaking in terms of technical aspects. And the whole aspect of that, you can hear every little individual thing, and it zeroes in, and then sometimes the lens is angled even wider. Dylan O'Brien even said in an interview that he was like, well, you kind of have to understand that like at any given moment, Raimi might shoot you with an heightened angled lens, which you can feel for sure. And there are so many zoom-ins in particular on Dylan O'Brien's eyes, where you just see the kind of glimmers that are in there of like what he's thinking and what he's processing. And overall, it was just one of those things that like it really caught me, because I definitely end up being one of those people that's like, oh, they don't make them like they used to. I'm not even really that old to be saying that, but I just got done watching the Lord of the Rings extended editions again recently, and blockbusters, this isn't a blockbuster, but blockbusters in modern movies aren't made like that all the time anymore. And here felt very much like a person with a vision. This easily could have been... I can see a world in which this is very much one of those like, oh, it's like a Netflix, straight to Netflix thing, and then it's about these two people stranded on an island, and it's like a back and forth thing. If this was made by other people. But the thing is, Sam Raimi has such a stamp in terms of his vision and who he is as a director that absolutely, you're not going to think that it's anybody else but him. He just has a very, very specific style, especially with horror. And so that wants me to get into another positive. I want to talk about the horror comedy aspects of this. I think that this movie is so brilliant at guiding through tone, it is unbelievably funny. I think that Dylan O'Brien and Rachel McAdams, if you haven't seen Game Night, that movie is fantastic. And Dylan O'Brien is just overall a very talented. I can't remember what else I've seen him in. I think I saw him in this thing with Zoe Deutsch, right? Where she's like pretending that she went to Paris or something to that effect. But he's great in that. He's great in Maze Runner, obviously. And I know that he has comedic talent. I haven't seen some of the things that he was in from the previous year that I'm aware of he was brilliant in, but I think he's brilliant in this. He really nails this really like douchebag fraternity guy and his laugh. Everything you need to know about this character, hear him laugh, hear him say one line, you know instantly the type of guy he is. Even early on, he's hiring these women and he's asking, how far are you willing to go for me? And while Rachel McAdams interrupts before that goes any further, but you can identify exactly what type of character this is. It's definitely somebody who like absolutely idolizes American Psycho for all the wrong reasons, which the reason why I also bring that up is because there's a character named Donovan in this that is dressed exactly like Patrick Bateman. And that's how I know that this movie has a sense of humor about itself, because all of the business people at the beginning, all of the company guys are like frat bro, like douchebag guys. And they just have that like inner like, oh, we love golf and all of that. And I thought that it's definitely broader in terms of the type of critique it's going for, but there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, not everything needs to be subtle, especially if they are going for over the top, which we'll talk about in a second, which this movie is able to guide through a lot of the humor and then a lot of the horror really well, by also balancing out through one more thing. The body horror and the gore in this is ridiculous. I think that there's a scene really early on that kind of introduces you to the type of heightened reality that you're going to be getting into, where Rachel McAdams is very much she's like feeling the thrill of hunting a boar for the first time, and that scene is so well done. It utilizes a lot of Raimi's signature thing he does, where it's called a POV shot. And the POV shot it's exactly what it sounds like. It's from the point of view of the thing that she's chasing in this case, which is the boar. And it's so great because it puts you in the environment where, not knowing where she is, and she jumps down and around, and like she's just very much feeling the thrill of it. And what I notice is Sam Raimi is the type of director to do this. Yes, she could have killed it and the blood could have spurted all over her, which it does, but then the scene keeps going. She sticks the spear even further in, and then it like explodes onto her even more, and then even more. But on top of that, that's not the only bodily fluid getting onto her from the boar. It's also this like mucus coming out of his nose and like spurting onto her while this is happening, and it's done in such close up detail that you can't help but be like, ugh. And I dig a lot of this a lot. My personal favorite moment that's like this, though, that I busted out laughing at because of how ridiculous and how gross it was, is this scene where later on, we're going to get to the plot part of it, but just to like sort of shortcut so I can tell you this, the plot point where Dylan O'Brien has kind of learned some stuff from her. He's like secretly building a raft while he's trying to escape because of this previous scene that we'll talk about in a bit. But he's like, okay, so I'm going to make you dinner the next night. Let me do that for you. And it's sort of a payoff, like a Chekhov's gun thing from earlier with these berries that she tells him not to eat because they are poisonous. And it turns out that's what he puts on the sushi that he's giving her. And so he tries to run out and on this raft, but he crashes back on because the waves are too strong. And she's trying to save him and give him CPR, but while she's giving him CPR, she's projectile vomiting because of the poison from earlier. So while she's trying to do this, it keeps shooting onto him over and over while she's still trying to like get into his mouth. And it's so funny because of how determined she is to still save him, but also just the visual of having to like deal with the vomit and all of it on top of him while she's doing this. I had a very, very reactive theater. It was very funny, but also there's multiple moments where you could hear people be like, oh. And the biggest one, this is a moment where I couldn't help but think I knew where it was going, so I wasn't like fully like shocked by this. But there's a scene in this in which after this, she feeds him this thing that also poisons him and he can't move his body. And the camera doesn't pan down, so we're meant to assume that she's cutting off his penis. And you just see like her like narrate while she's doing it, because he can't look down, he can't control, so he can't see, but he also can't feel anything. And you see this, you hear all of like the squirming, and then the blood spurts onto his face, but then she holds it up and it's a rat. And so the payoff is just kind of like, she says, if you do that again, that won't actually be a rat. And I thought that was really well done and really tense, because you can see, again, another zoom in on Dylan O'Brien's eyes, which get a lot of close-up work in this that I thought was really great. And really transitioning into like plot points themselves, let's first talk about the performances from Rachel McAdams and Dylan O'Brien. I think that they're fantastic. They really are I sound like ridiculous when you say this, but like a dynamic duo with each other. They're a powerhouse unit, especially Rachel McAdams in this. Rachel McAdams' character has an interesting arc because of this thing that she goes through before. We learn kind of in the middle of the movie, sort of like a part of her narrative drive, that she sort of had a tumultuous relationship with her husband, and that she gives him the keys because they were in a fight and he's drunk, and so he takes the keys, and that's kind of how he dies. And of course is brought up again later that Dylan O'Brien kind of insinuates that like, oh, was that really an accident that happened? But sorry guys, my allergies have been killing me. But this back and forth really transitions Rachel McAdams' character into, she's definitely playing out a fantasy here for herself. She loves this life. It's a huge detail early on that she's obsessed with the show Survivor, and that they even find this tape that she auditions to be on Survivor, and it's really corny. It's like really, this character is interesting because she's also meant to get on your nerves simultaneously, but it's just because she can't help it. She can't help but be like this. She has this nervous tick where she can't stop talking, and she gets herself into a lot of these awkward situations. And so the payoff of that later is that, I mean, naturally she knows all of the survival techniques here, and Dylan O'Brien doesn't, so he has to rely on her for these things. But she's clearly, it's a plot point later that we realize, it turns out that she was lying to him about, don't go past this X that like the rocks look like, because if you go past that, it's going to give you like rashes, and you'll be able to feel the skin sort of burning off of you if you do that. It turns out though that she has this knife at some point, but we don't really know where she gets it from. And she says, oh, it just washed up against the shore. You really can't determine what kind of things you'll find out there. And I mean, I bought it, but then it turns out that there's a house that was actually there the whole entire time that they could have been going to or like living in, and there's food in there, and she's been keeping it secret. It's like a really late third act plot twist, and it reminded me a lot of Triangle of Sadness, which had a very similar plot point in it. And then that escalates into this thing. But before we get to that, I want to mention Dylan O'Brien, who I think is giving a very, very committed performance. It's a lot more physical than you might anticipate, because he is injured early on. So like I said, he has to do a lot of this physical acting, but you don't necessarily ever root for him, because he was a terrible person even from the very beginning. But he is subjected to this, that we realize later on, because Rachel McAdams sees some boats that keep passing by, and she's like, no, not yet. And you're like, and this happens pretty early on in the movie, but even to the extent you think that she's keeping him there for that, but then we find out later on that there was that house the whole time, so they could have actually been just living out like a decent life, because the house they find is like owned by a billionaire, and it's very, very nice. And this escalates into the third act that we'll talk about, but really just mentioning that the two leads again are just really fantastic in this. And I do think that Rachel McAdams is very, very underrated in terms of her acting ability with comedy. I mentioned Game Night, which I think is a fantastic movie, and she's also incredible in Mean Girls. We know that for sure. But here, she's really able to utilize that again. She has such great comedic timing that really lends to the horror aspects of this as well. one of my favorite moments in this is when we find out his fiance shows up to save Dylan O'Brien, and then it cuts and we don't really know what happened to her, but we kind of assume that she died, and she keeps saying, oh, she slipped, I couldn't save her. But it turns out that she actually like hit this guy over the head with a rock that was with them, so she fell down to her death. And she buries her, but she doesn't bury her that well, so her hand is still sticking out with her engagement ring still out when Dylan O'Brien is trying to hunt the boar by himself. And that's just another classic Raimi thing. If you don't know, Raimi also has this thing for hands sticking out of the ground. It's also like he could not help but include a zombie randomly in this at one point. It's in a dream sequence, but still it still shows up. He just had to do it, and it looked very cool. It was only on screen for like 2 seconds, but one thing I will say is it's funny because I feel like there is something to probably be said about like power dynamics and like the workplace, and maybe it's a metaphor for that, but then also it's very much just like very straightforward in terms of its narrative. So it's one of those things where it's very much just like, it doesn't necessarily have to be metaphorical. It doesn't really feel metaphorical. It's very, very blunt and in your face. And we know that because of the third act. One of my favorite moments is when they start leaning really heavily into the body horror. There's a moment where they start fighting each other that this escalates, where Dylan O'Brien like rips part of her scalp off and the hair comes with it. And he like starts pressing his thumb into her eye and she looks insane, and they just keep going back and forth in this very physical way. This is just a very physical performance committed by these two, and I thought that it was really well done. I do think that the overall, like I said, I thought this was fantastic, but there are a couple of issues with it, and I think that one of them, I don't know if Disney was picky about money. I don't know if it was one of those things where they were like, hey, you only have such amount of budget. At times, the CG is a little wonky, and it definitely relies on practical effects for the most part, but there was this one shot the plane looked fine, but there was some stuff occasionally where they would be up on a cliff or on a mountain, and then a lot of it is clearly shot on location, so it made me wonder what happened there, where sometimes the background looked a little odd. But like I said, Bill Pope, sometimes he really likes to saturate his background lighting, so part of me was like, I wonder if it's one of those things, or I wonder if just overall it felt like a green screen. Maybe it wasn't, but it still looked a little off to me. But that was just once or twice. And then one other thing is I kind of think in the middle that it doesn't lag. I think it's just kind of like, okay, what are we doing here? You can tell that it's definitely building up to the third act, the plot point, the twist sort of it all, but the whole thing that comes with that though is it starts to turn into like this weird demented romantic comedy on an island, because you think that they're like falling for each other, but they're really not. Dylan O'Brien's kind of just like playing a part so he can like get out of there, and it's just very, very interesting because all that stuff is very funny. There's a scene where they start drinking this wine that she made off of the island, and she says, I don't think we should ever leave. And there's this zoom in on Dylan O'Brien's face that is so funny, and it had the entire audience, like I said, like laugh out loud. There are so many moments like that where Dylan O'Brien starts to give a reaction shot of like, oh shit, like what type of situation am I currently in? And I thought all of that was very, very well done. I think it was just like I said, like the pacing kind of in the middle was a little, it didn't necessarily get slow. I think it was just kind of like, okay, let's find our footing to get into the third part of this, which is when it escalates into him finding the house, and it ends up being this thing where that's when the back and forth starts happening. And it has one of the best match cuts I've seen in a long time. There are some that were in like Breaking Bad, for example, that are like this, but there's this whole setup at the beginning that he's like obsessed with golf, and towards the end it's very, it's karma. She kills him with a golf club that's hanging in the house that they run into, and he says that Linda from accounting, and then she keeps saying over and over, she's like, I'm from strategy and planning, I believe. And that this line in her Survivor thing is so funny when she's like, I want to be on Survivor because I'm from strategy and planning. That's how you know I'm always 10 steps ahead, which I thought was really funny. And I think that a lot of the character work I thought was very interesting here, because it's interesting to utilize stereotypes, but to also play into the stereotypes to kind of break them down a little bit. Because there are some brief moments where you can tell the type of character Linda is just based off of small things at the beginning. Like, for example, she's sharing this toast with peanut butter on it with her bird, and she lives alone with her bird, and she's just talking to him like, oh, we're going to move up in the world. And she has, from the get-go, the introduction shot of her is that she has motivational posters that she has framed in her house, and you instantly know exactly what kind of character she is, because she's like breaking down in her car and she's saying something to the effect of like, you can do it, you can believe in yourself, and she's just repeating those like motivational posters, you know, the ones that are like, they're kind of passive aggressive if you really think about it, where they're like, you can do it, and if you can't, then are you really failing anyone but yourself? It's like stuff like that where you're like, what is the intent here? But Dylan O'Brien is very much fitting into that archetype of that like frat bro fraternity like douchebag guy, and then he kind of delves into his own backstory a little bit, and it's just very fascinating when you break it down, because yeah, sure, they have a few different character things, and you can see that she's like definitely feeling relinquished in this area of freedom out in the wilderness. Like, she was made for this, she has nothing to return to back there, so she's kind of like, well, why do I need to? And he's very like pampered and doesn't have any clue how to do anything. And I just thought that was a really fascinating breakdown. And I can see like a world in which you could not stand either of these characters. And I found it really interesting. It's definitely a big swing to make the main character likable, but also like really kind of, she's supposed to get on your nerves a little bit, but I thought she was like very funny in that way. And you know, I mean, I'm not gonna lie, I kind of ended up rooting for her. I'm like, no, I mean, I want to see her fully pay off and like survive. And the ending, like the bookend, where it turns out that she's like golfing and she grew to love the sport, and she's saying that she was the only survivor out there, and that she like had to manage to survive, and what keeps her going is that she had the memory of the survivors that were there, and she ends up being famous. She's like golfing for this like celebrity golf thing that I thought was hilarious, and then it pays off with this book that she says she's writing, one of the survival books that she was like obsessed with at the beginning, about you can't rely on anybody to save you but yourself, or something like that, which is very funny and very ironic, because Dylan O'Brien, you know, relied on her until, you know, he couldn't anymore. But it's funny that she even goes back. I thought that it was going to end with her like just living the rest of her life out there and just having a great life, but no, she goes back. But overall, yeah, I thought that this was so much fun. It was fantastic. I really liked the mixtures of horror and comedy that were in this, and I thought it balanced itself really well. Overall, I'm gonna give this a score now. The negative was, like I said, just some of the pacing in the middle a little bit, and then some of the CG stuff, but that's about it. I'm gonna give this a very, very solid 4 out of 5. I had a ton of fun with this. What did you guys think of Send Help, directed by Sam Raimi? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Or are you somewhere between on it? I want to know. Up next is going to be the mockumentary about Charlie XCX's brat Summer, but apparently it's a deconstruction of it. I'm very, very excited for it. I'm very curious about it. I love mockumentaries. Popstar, Never Stop, Never Stopping. I'm assuming it's like that. I love that movie. But yeah, stay tuned for that. Again, guys, I'm very curious about both Iron Lung and, like I said, that AI thing I've heard is terrible, but I can't help it. I might review it if I have the time. But again, thank you guys so much for listening and watching. Stay tuned. I'm doing some shorts to catch up with the Best Picture winners. I recorded one for Train Dreams. It's just a couple minutes long. We'll have that out later. But for now, thank you guys so much for listening and watching. I'll see you next time.